Jack, we've completed the IFR departure briefing, and we discussed some of the performance characteristics of your new Baron. The technique for mental preparation for takeoff was described, and various ways of coping with mechanical and instrument failures were demonstrated.
I feel much more confident now about that departure phase, and I was particularly interested in the options available, such as a departure alternate airport.
You pointed that out, and you also mentioned some topics that we're going to be covering that seem very important to me. Let's see if I remember, you included among other topics airways charts, of course, and communications, navigation, an area I feel pretty confident in. IFR emergencies, it's at the forefront of my thinking. Weather, of course, and mountain flying because of the terrain, and what you call command decisions.
Now, Jack, one of the first things we should do to brief for the en route is to check the effective date on the low altitude en route chart. Now, we'll be using chart 9 and 10 to begin with here, and the effective date on this chart is the 21st of November 1985. Now, these charts come out, about once every 4 months. In the meantime, there are changes, so we want to check the revision data, and we'll notice that effective October the 25th, the Grand Junction, Colorado ident was changed. Now, that could be important to us, so we want to make sure we have the latest chart.
Yeah, because we're using Grand Junction.
That's right, as part of our flight plan. Down on the face of the chart here, notice that the heavy lines indicate the chart that we have in our hand. Now, not quite so obvious. Down those charts are some vertical dashed lines, very faint vertical dashed lines, dividing the charts into 3 panels. Now, each of those 3 panels is divided into 4 sections, A, B, C, and D. Now, notice that on each panel is a cardinal city. For instance, Denver, Grand Junction, Salt Lake City. Now, if we turn the chart over to the back, we find there's a zigdex at the top, and each city that we saw on the panels on the front are listed here.
Okay, instead of index, they've made it a zigzag. I see, zigdex, got it.
Now, on this back of this also is a communications panel here, and every airport that has ATC communications is listed here in alphabetical order. So we can come down the list here until we find Denver, and of course there are several airports at Denver. We're interested in Stapleton, and the official designator for Stapleton is listed here, KDEN.
What's that P3B after that?
Okay, remember we talked about the panels. Okay, Denver can be found on panel 3, section B. Now let's check that out. We'll just put our finger here on Denver. We'll open it up, and here is panel 3 and section B, and sure enough, we find Denver on that section. Now notice, Jack, that the uncontrolled airspace here is blue, and the controlled airspace is white.
Seems to be less and less blue on all these charts.
Yes.
More controlled airspace.
Jack, the heavy dashed lines shown here indicate there is an area chart for Denver. And here and on the area chart itself, we can find the upper limits of the Denver Terminal Control Area, or TCA. And if you want more information on the TCA, you can go to the TCA chart.
Or an area chart, would that have it on there too?
Well, the area chart wouldn't give you all the exact altitudes. You'd have to go to a TCA chart to find all of those.
Okay. Now we have this waffled area here, that's the TCA?
That's the outline of the TCA, the waffled area. It doesn't give it too clearly. That's why I say go to the TCA chart to find all the details of it.
Yeah, okay.
Now, Jack, it's a good idea to keep track of the weather as we're traveling. And let's check a few ways that we can do that. Now, one of the ways we can do it is to check with Flight Service Station. Now, notice at Kremling, the first VOR on our route, that Denver guards 122.1. Now, we would have to listen on the Kremling VOR. That's a remote station out of Denver. And the speed that you see here means that they guard 122.1, but they don't broadcast on that frequency. Now, we can call and get weather for the Kremling area, but we must tell them that we're listening on the Kremling VOR, because they broadcast on several remote sites.
And we have it tuned in already and identified.
That's correct.
So we might as well listen to it.
That's correct. Now, you probably remember that there was a scheduled broadcast of weather on VORs 15 minutes after the hour. Well, they don't do that anymore. However, they do broadcast SIGMETs and AirMETs whenever necessary on the VORs. And then if you want more detailed information on that particular SIGMET, you can call FSS and they'll read the actual SIGMET to you and give you more detailed information.
Okay, well, what about 122.0?
Well, yes. Now, note that Denver Flight Watch is available at the Grand Junction VOR.
Denver WX.
That's correct.
2.0, okay.
And again, this is remoted out of Denver, you see, and it's Flight Watch 122.0. Now, remember, they will not accept or close flight plans for you. They're strictly weather. But the good thing about it is they can put you into direct contact with another aircraft that might be in the area that you're concerned about, you see, where you're going to go.
And I think out here in the mountains, that would be, extremely important.
Oh, I've used it many times too.
Because on one side or the other side of the mountain, the weather's so variable.
And you can talk directly to the pilot who is there, and he'll tell you what the weather is firsthand.
That's great.
Now, Grand Junction has its own flight service station, as you can see by the other frequencies here. And you can talk to Grand Junction, and they can probably also give you some weather. But to get first-hand weather, I would always go to 122.0.
Is that an asterisk after the DENWX? Is that an asterisk there?
Yes, it is, Jack. And remember, an asterisk means not continuous operation. As a matter of fact, the Flight Watch service operates from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. local time and is mostly for aircraft operating above 5,000 feet.
And we're certainly doing that here.
We certainly are. Now, in addition, another way of getting weather is there are certain transcribed weather broadcasts which go on continuously, and they will be indicated by TWEB.
Tweebs.
Tweebs. Now, if you have trouble locating the areas which are being discussed in the tweebs, just take out this chart from your manual, the in-flight weather advisory reference locations, and listed here are all of the locations which they will refer to. They won't refer to locations that you don't see here, so this is a great help. Now, in addition to that, all of the weather radar stations are listed here in the JEPS manual on a page here called the National Weather Radar Service Network. Now, notice out east there are a lot of radar stations, and out west there are just a few, and we have many sites that are remoted out west here because we don't have near as many thunderstorms in the west as we do further east.
I noticed there that, for example, Salt Lake City has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6
remote sites.
Yeah.
That's correct.
And out east of, say, Kansas, there we have virtually no remote sites.
That's true.
Yeah.
Now, I want you to notice also, Jack, that the VORs that we use for this particular route are all mandatory reporting sites, and that's indicated by the solid triangle within the VOR symbol.
So at each of those areas, then we have to, it's a mandatory report. So, okay.
And we're also lucky, too, we can use these for our DME work. The scalloped ring means that each one of them has DME, and in addition to that, down in the frequency box, you'll see a small D. That also means that the station is equipped with DME.
Now, I noticed when I was looking at this before we started talking, Tony, that some of these shadows around these boxes are different. Some are heavy shadows, and some are kind of partial shadows.
Well, don't worry about that, Jack. They're in the process of changing over to the heavier shadow. Those partial shadows you will no longer see later on. There really is no difference. If it's a shadowed box, it means that it is a component of the airway system.
Okay.
That VOR is a component of the airway system. But now notice, Jack, that between Grand Junction and Hanksville is a terminal VOR. Now, a terminal VOR is not a component of the airway system and should only be used below 12,000 feet and within 25 nautical miles of the VOR. Also, between Grand Junction and Hanksville is a COP, or a changeover point, at the Eddles intersection.
That's that kind of Z line there, okay?
That's correct, and it gives you the mileage at which you should change over.
All right.
Now, if there is no changeover point designated, then change over about halfway between the two VORs.
Okay.
Remember that an airway is controlled airspace that is 4 nautical miles wide, that is each side of the center line.
Yeah, I understand it, but for example, out here and some other places, they look wider somewhere near the center.
Well, they are. You see, as you get further and further away from the VOR, the signal will get weaker and weaker. And so they take that into consideration. In the TRPS manual, for instance, they show how they draw 4.5 degree accuracy lines from the VOR out, and at about 51 miles, those lines will cross this 4-mile boundary. And from that point on, the airway gets wider.
Oh, I see. They widen out, of course.
Yes.
Yeah, that's understandable.
And whenever you see a wide point in the airway, about right at the widest point will be the changeover point, and it might be considerably closer to one of the VORs than it is to the other.
But you protect, by making it wider at those points there, you protect it even more because of the accuracy.
That's correct.
Okay.
And that accuracy or reception might be influenced by the terrain.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in addition to the 4-mile wide airway and the protection on those accuracy lines, there is also another 2 miles of secondary obstruction clearance depicted here in the TRPS manual. So actually, you have some protection out to 6 miles either side of the center line. We'll only consider the primary zone, which is 4 miles.
You'll still have the obstruction clearance out in this 2-mile area.
Yes, but
okay.
It won't be as great as it is within the 4 miles.
Okay.
Now, Jack, on Victor 382, northeast of Bryce Canyon, has a minimum obstruction clearance altitude, which is lower than the minimum en route altitude.
Now that's a MOCA, M-O-C-A?
Yes.
Yeah.
Minimum obstruction clearance altitude. The MEA is, in this case, 16,000 feet, while the MOCA is 12,800 feet. And notice the MOCA is always followed by the letter T.
And what's the T stand for?
That just stands for terrain.
Okay.
Because the MOCA gives you terrain clearance. And the MOCA guarantees reception of a navigable signal only out to 22 nautical miles from the VOR.
I see several of these out here. There's one right up there, one down here. Yeah.
Yes, there are quite a few out in this mountainous terrain.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, in many cases, if you're flying VFR, you can fly the MOCA where you might have a little trouble getting up to the MEA. Now, if we were approaching Bryce Canyon on Victor 382, and we had received a clearance for an approach to the Bryce Canyon airport, we could begin the descent from the MEA if we are within 22 nautical miles of the Bryce Canyon VOR. But, of course, we would not want to descend below the MOCA until we were on a segment of the approach.
Okay.
Now, when there's a change in the MEA or the MOCA, other than at a nav aid, a crossbar is used on the airway. Now, southwest of Bryce Canyon at Matzo intersection, we see such an example.
See it right here.
That's right. Notice, too, an example of a directional MEA between the Matzo intersection and the Mormon Mesa VOR. The arrows indicate that northeastbound flights could be at 12,000 feet, while southwestbound flights could be at 9,000 feet.
So that indicates that the terrain is dropping off if you're heading southwest, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
It indicates rapidly changing terrain.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Jack, if it should become necessary for you to climb above 18,000 feet and into the high-altitude structure for a short period of time, you could use the information provided by the green lines on your airway chart. Mm-hmm. Now, JEPS provides this information for easy transition to the high-altitude sector, but it's useful for those rare occasions when you're forced to climb to a higher altitude, such as to top clouds and things of that nature.
Well, but I don't have the J charts, the high-altitude charts.
Well, that's okay to do this for short periods of time, but inform ATC that you don't have the high-altitude charts so that they won't be referring to information on charts that you don't have.
Okay.
Let me give you another example of planning ahead. Note that between Grand Junction and Hanksville, that there's a changeover point from Denver to Salt Lake Center Control.
That's this dotted line here.
That's right. It's shown by the blue dotted line. Now, if Denver should fail to give you a frequency, or if you desire to initiate a call to the Salt Lake Center, you can use the frequency in the dotted communications box just northwest of Hanksville. Now, the next change to the Los Angeles Center will occur just after passing Bryce Canyon. Now, be alert to these changeovers, Jack, and if the center does not hand you over to the next center, question them. Sometimes the controller will anticipate a temporary loss of communications as you approach the edge of his coverage, and he may ask you to contact the next controller at a specific time or fix. Now, do not switch over to that frequency until you reach that time or that fix. Now, if you should lose navigation capability, and you might if you're flying at minimum altitude, ask the radar people for radar guidance until you are again receiving a good VOR signal. Now, if you don't receive instructions to climb to a higher altitude required by the next route segment, query the controller in time for you to climb to that altitude at the required point. If you find that you have lost communications, then you must initiate the climb. If there's a minimum crossing altitude, begin the climb so that you cross the fix at the designated altitude or higher.
Well, I saw some boxes here that say minimum crossing altitude, so I've got to keep an eye on those as I plan my flight.
Yes, and if it's at a VOR, you'll notice that it's a little blue ball, and then you must refer to the minimum crossing altitude box on the chart.
Okay.
Okay, now, if you received and expect clearance to a higher altitude or even a lower altitude, you would climb or descend at the time that you were given the time to expect that clearance. This is if you've lost communications. Okay, and then you would always maintain the altitude assigned, or the one you expect to have, or MEA, whichever is higher. Now, Jack, I was an air traffic controller for about 15 years. And you know, there are some things a pilot can do to make the controller's job easier and increase safety for everyone. For instance, when the pilot is given a number of any kind, such as a heading, an altitude, or an altimeter setting, or even a transponder code, he should read it back for confirmation. And when he's handed off to another controlling agency, he should acknowledge the transfer. And Jack, read back information in the order in which you received it. It's just not just a matter of courtesy, but it increases efficiency and safety as well.
I've found myself getting into the habit of reading by and large the numbers. You know, just boom, 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 and not, you know, the stuff between the numbers. If I can tell them that it's 0, 3, 0, and 2000, they seem to appreciate that.
That's correct. Now, none of that is required, but it sure helps. On the initial call, for instance, to an ATC facility, give him your full call sign on the first call and tell him the altitude that you're at. If you happen to be climbing to an assigned altitude, tell him the altitude to which you're climbing. Now, this will allow the controller to verify your Mode C readout. As you know, it must be within 300 feet to assure separation in IFR weather. When ATC issues instructions, they expect a prompt response.
Now, how prompt is prompt?
Well, you should begin the action just as quickly as you can. And then you must climb or descend as expeditiously as safe operation will permit until you're within 1,000 feet of the assigned altitude. Then the last 1,000 feet of climb or descent should be conducted at about 500 feet per minute. And you should inform ATC any time that you cannot climb or descend at a rate of at least 500 feet per minute so they can pre-plan.
Now, in some planes, I remember when I had a 182 before I got the Bonanza, which preceded the Baron, at these altitudes it wasn't going to climb at 500 feet a minute.
Well, if you're at 10,000 feet and you tell them you're a 182 and you're going to climb, they don't expect 500 feet per minute. But in normal conditions in a twin, they do expect at least 500.
And certainly a turbocharged or something.
Yeah. But so many people just take their time, and that's what we're referring to here. And, you know, communications, that is human-to-human communications, still a vital part of air traffic control. And when there are errors in headings, altitudes, or altimeter settings, a where are you going situation can occur. You know, air traffic control transmissions fall into just 3 broad categories. ATC can issue clearances, advisories, or they can make requests.
And Lord knows there's enough area for error there.
Yes, and you know, NASA publishes a monthly bulletin called Callback, in which many such errors are reported by the airlines, the military, general aviation, and air traffic controllers as well. I refer to these reports as accidents that didn't happen by accident. You know, a few months ago, this bulletin described a new policy which was dubbed squeal a deal or snitch batch.
I've heard just a little bit about that. What is that?
Well, it's an automatic reporting system. You know, up to that time, a controller could choose not to report deviations from the required flight parameters if nobody complained. But now technology may have taken that prerogative away from him. See, the bulletin stated, that ATC has established a stringent quality control program, they call it QAP, to minimize these separation standards violations. And all of the centers now have the capability. Conflict Alert, which was the previous system in use, merely indicated the possibility of less than required separation. And the controllers then called the error to the pilot's attention, and they could suggest corrective action. But now Snitch says the violation has occurred and records the fact, and this can result in punitive action regardless of the controller's attitude. So Jack, if any doubt whatsoever exists, question the controller and try to get an acknowledgement to your readback. Sometimes the mistake occurs even after the readback is made by the pilot.
You mean the controller will hear something wrong?
That's right. As a matter of fact, in issue number 79 of NASA's Bulletin of Callback, addresses that particular situation. The author notes that readback plus hearback equals safety. Hearback is a new term that he invented. So often, you know, we hear what we expect to hear and miss what was really said. And when we then act on this miscommunication, a dangerous situation can be created without us even being aware of it. Now, you know, since its original inception, Jack, Snitch has been modified somewhat, so you might want to check with your local ATC facility to learn its present status.
Yeah, I think that'd probably be a good idea. Just give them a call and say, you know, are you using this and to what extent?
That's right. Jack, if you fly this intended route very often, from Denver to Carlsbad, there's one hazard that you should be especially guarded against.
What's that?
That's icing. It's very dangerous because it cannot be accurately forecast. Sure, the conditions conducive to ice formation can be forecast, but then it may or may not occur. The only anti-ice equipment on your aircraft is pitot heat and electric prop anti-ice, and you have no de-ice equipment at all. You know, even if I had full anti-ice and de-ice equipment, I would not venture into known icing conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Just my personal feeling.
Sure.
An NTSB study released in 1981 revealed that of nearly 17,000 accidents from 1976 through 1979, 178 involved structural icing. And now listen to this. Even though icing was involved in only 1% of these accidents, 56% of the total fatalities occurred in accidents involving structural icing. And the NTSB report stated that the record indicates that pilots frequently do not exercise good judgment in avoiding icing conditions in flight. You remember, icing areas do not show up well on radar, either whether it's the controller's radar or the radar in your aircraft.
Right.
So the first clue that you may have is the actual formation of ice on the airplane itself. Now, sometimes in relatively flat countries, such as out here in the Midwest, a VFR on top clearance is a good way to avoid icing. You don't have to go to be on top of all clouds to use VFR on top.
That's a VFR on top is very confusing to me. Even when I had my rating before, I tended not to use it because I really didn't understand it.
I'll refer you to some publications that will clear that up for you as we go along. You see, it's a sort of a combination VFR and IFR clearance, but you must climb or descend to VFR conditions, and then you must fly at the appropriate VFR altitude for your direction of flight.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you must comply with VFR visibility and distance from cloud criteria, and you must also comply with all instrument flight rules applicable to that flight. For example, the minimum IFR altitudes, position reporting, radio watch, designated course, and adherence to ATC instructions.
Mm-hmm.
You may change altitude as long as you maintain VFR conditions, but you must inform ATC that you're changing. You don't have to ask permission, just keep them informed. Now, you will receive traffic information, but remember, it's the pilot's responsibility to see and avoid other VFR and IFR traffic.
Okay.
Now, the Airman's Information Manual, an examinogram number 6 entitled VFR Operations on an IFR Flight Plan, contains detailed information on this subject, Jack.
Oh. But along this route, VFR en route to avoid icing doesn't seem like a viable option, Tony.
I think you're right, Jack, because you're already at such a high altitude you can't climb and you can't descend because of the hills and mountains below you. You know, Jack, there's a great deal that is known about various forms of ice and its effect on aircraft, and there's a great deal that is not known. And I think you'll agree that it's not a good idea to experiment with the unknown. There are many sources of information on the subject, but for solid basic facts, I recommend a study of Chapter 10 in Advisory Circular 006A, Aviation Weather. And to make the best use of all of the services that the government provides in this respect, and to learn how to avoid entanglements with nasty weather in flight, get a copy of the supplement to 006A, Aviation Weather Services. These two publications are probably the best available for pilots who want to understand and avoid unfavorable weather phenomena. Now, although I mentioned that you may venture into the high-altitude structure in special circumstances, Jack, I'm not suggesting that you subscribe to the high-altitude en route charts, but I am going to suggest that you always carry two other types of charts, the Jeppesen random RNAV en route charts and selected sectional charts. You know, Jack, you said that you were concerned because the single-engine service ceiling of the Barron is lower than the minimum en route altitude on the airway between Denver and Los Angeles.
That and icing are my two big concerns about this whole route.
That's very good, because you might be able to get around that by complying with Part 135 rules, FAR Part 135, which are for air taxi. And they don't fly at all on such routes if their single-engine service ceiling is lower than the MDA.
So if I held myself to 135 standards, then I would be ruling out, you know, these possibilities.
To a great extent. But you might find that's too restrictive, so you might want to take some other protective measures. First, on your RNAV chart number 3 and 4, trace your filed routing. Now, draw a circle around some of the airports shown along that route. As we leave the Denver area, for instance, we might want to put a circle around Granby and Kremling, and then Eagle and Glenwood Springs, Grand Junction. Do this all the way to the Los Angeles area. Now go to the airport and facility listing pages and put the RNAV coordinates for Granby in the #1 position on your RNAV receiver. Your RNAV allows you to preset 10 programmed airports. Now, as you pass the first ones, then you can program others down the line. Incidentally, Jack, while we're talking about the RNAV charts, let me illustrate another function. Notice that the chart is divided into a series of small rectangular grids, and within each grid are two numbers, a large one and a small one. Now, these numbers represent thousands and hundreds of feet above sea level. If the first number is 7 or less, then 1,000-foot clearance above all obstacles in that grid is provided if the designated altitude is flown. If the number is greater than 7, then 2,000-foot clearance is provided within the grid. Now, this information will permit safe flight on direct routes between VORs or between RNAV waypoints.
Those look like the numbers that you see on a sectional chart.
Yes, but they have different meaning here because they provide obstacle clearance, where on a sectional chart they do not.
On a sectional, they just indicate the highest obstacle in that area.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And now we have some emergency. Now that we have some emergency landing fields plotted, we can eyeball a possible heading to turn to if an emergency arises in flight. Then we can quickly tune and set in the RNAV course direct to that airport. But of course, it might be wise to know more about that airport, Jack, so refer to the sectional chart again. For instance, we can learn here that Garfield County Airport is 5,552 feet above sea level, is lighted, has a Unicom on 122.8, and has 2 runways oriented generally east and west. Now, you can also get some idea of the terrain surrounding the airport as we approach.
Sure.
You can also quickly determine if there is a published approach to these airports. Refer now to your low altitude en route chart. If the airport name on this chart is in capital letters and is followed by the name of the state, then there's an approach to that airport. So we know that Kremling will have an approach, but of course Granby and Glenwood Springs will not. So learn as much as you can in advance about these airports. A good source of some concise information might be the AOPA Airport Directory, for instance. This sort of advanced planning will add to your peace of mind during the entire trip.
And that's what I want, is peace of mind when I'm flying over the Rockies.
Exactly. Now, Jack, if an emergency should occur, maintain control of the situation. Take care of the emergency and configure the aircraft before calling ATC. See, so often we hear of aircraft calling the tower when an emergency occurs on takeoff. Sometimes the gear is still down and the prop is windmilling. Listen carefully to TV broadcasts and you'll find that even airline pilots do this. It's instinctive. Now, of course, no one can help you but yourself, so take this opportunity to give the greatest assistance possible to yourself. And when the aircraft is under control, you can report the event in a calm, matter-of-fact manner, and then tell the controller your desires. Don't ask for his advice. Now, if you should lose an engine above the absolute single-engine ceiling, you can use a drift-down technique, Jack. It's the opposite side of the coin from the VY best rate of climb that we used on takeoff. To lose altitude at the least possible rate, you must apply full power to the good engine, trim the aircraft, and then let down at the calculated VY speed for your altitude and weight. Now, this will result in an airspeed somewhere between VY, the blue line, and VMC, the red line. Now, you'll have time to experiment with this. Start at the blue line, then gradually reduce your speed while monitoring the rate of descent. And eventually, you'll find a speed that will result in the least rate of descent.
Okay, I'll try that sometime.
You know, once about an hour out of Denver, I lost an engine on a 421 at about 24,000 feet en route to San Francisco. I contacted the center and I told them that I was descending and that I was headed for Montrose, Colorado. My RNAV was tuned in and all I needed from the center was radar monitoring until I became VFR, which I did at about 18,000 feet. You know, telling center what I was doing was much more comforting than seeking advice from a controller who probably was not a multi-engine pilot. I declared an emergency in this case because, you know, initially I was on IFR with one engine out and could not maintain the assigned altitude. I did not squawk 7700 though because I had radio contact with the center. They did give me a discrete frequency. And contrary to what you may have heard about declaring an emergency, I was not asked to write a letter to the administrator. As a matter of fact, I have declared an emergency on several different occasions and I've never been questioned by the FAA. It's always better to err on that safe side. I'm sure your insurance underwriter, he thinks so too. Don't be timid about using the emergency authority that's granted to pilots under FAR Part 91.3.
You know, I talked to some pilots and they say, you know, I would never declare an emergency, or not never, but I mean they would have to be going down in flame out of fuel before they declare an emergency. And I always think that's kind of stupid. I don't think it's that big a thing. I've declared not an emergency, but had a precautionary landing earlier, and there was no problem with that.
No. As a matter of fact, Jack, in many cases, if you don't declare an emergency, the controller will declare it for you, so you might as well do it.
Well, that's what happened in this case. And in fact, thought I was having an engine problem, and they rolled the trucks, and I said, I don't think I need the trucks. I've got it straightened out now. And they said, too late. We've already done it. You know, they're there.
But if anything had happened, you'd have been on the safe side of that one.
Sure.
You know, Jack, this is going to be a tough route for you to fly in an unpressurized aircraft, normally aspirated engines. But we know that many pilots tackle this route in single-engine aircraft. So with proper pre-flight planning and the application of some good judgment along the way, we can negotiate the route safely. Now, almost the entire route is over mountainous terrain. This FAA publication offers some excellent advice on mountain flying. Unfortunately, though, you're going to have to learn most of the lessons and the techniques firsthand. You know, someone said that time is the best teacher, however, she ultimately kills all of her students. So try to learn as much as possible from experienced pilots and from the written word. You know, because of the Venturi effect, wind over mountain crests can be very strong. One sign that can warn pilots of the strong winds and the turbulent conditions is the lenticular cloud. Conditions will usually be VFR when you see these clouds, and the lens-shaped cloud will appear to be standing still, hence the nickname they have, standing wave clouds. The fact is, the clouds are forming and dissipating as the wind blows rapidly through them, and rotary clouds may sometimes be observed below them. The problem, Jack, is that even though you avoid the cloud formation and miss the severe turbulence, you may experience the effect of the mountain wave. Where the air is descending, you will not be able to maintain your altitude, even at full power. For instance, leaving McGuire Air Force Base in the DC-6, we would fly over Mount Washington in New England. Now, that's not a very large mountain by Western standards, but when caught in a descending mountain wave, nearly 10,000 horsepower could not maintain altitude. Sometimes the rate of descent exceeded 5,000 feet a minute.
Gee.
Now, recognize this phenomena early and be ready to reverse course if necessary. There's a section in the FAA weather manual which gives good advice on mountain flying, and the illustrations are worth thousands of words on the subject. Now, it's possible to encounter a descending mountain wave while you're in IFR conditions. Remember, immediately disengage the altitude hold on your autopilot if this should happen. See, it will try to maintain the selected altitude, and very quickly the nose-high attitude will dissipate the airspeed.
I see.
However, Jack, leave the autopilot engaged and monitor the attitude. The autopilot is not as strong as you are. Remember how easily you can overpower it? So it will not be as rough on the airplane as you might be. And you're less likely to over-control and lose control due to spatial disorientation. In this case, don't try to keep the altitude. Don't try to stay at your altitude. You can't. Concentrate on keeping the nose on the horizon. And now you will have only one variable to contend with. Otherwise, you'll be changing your power, your airspeed, your attitude, your trim, and also your altitude. Now again, be prepared to reverse course if necessary. Now, here are some cardinal points. First, if there's the slightest doubt about making this trip in the future, check with a competent and experienced flight instructor. Ask him to accompany you, and if he refuses because of doubtful weather, then don't you go alone. And secondly, read the fine print in your insurance policy. If the insurance examiners decide that you have violated any section of the FARs or the insurance policy itself, even if it didn't contribute to the event, you might find that you've made the most expensive trip of your life. Remember the prime principle, always leave yourself an out. You know, I know that in your work, Jack, you often drive yourself beyond the normal limits of endurance. And the penalty may be a job which is not up to your usual standards. But Jack, don't carry that over into your flying. Many businessmen believe that the sun won't rise unless they're at a particular place. And so many accidents are determined to be of unknown causes. And maybe fatigue is that unknown cause. If a pilot is ill, if he's taking medicine, had one cocktail too many, or maybe he's smoking funny cigarettes, it will usually show up in an autopsy. But fatigue won't. The investigators can only guess that the pilot was pooped based on his actions prior to and during the flight. And believe me, if you stayed over another day, a year from now you won't remember it. But if you push yourself, at some point you're going to experience a flight that you'll never forget, or on the other hand, you'll never remember. You know, today at lunch we talked about survival equipment, and of course we won't have time to go into that subject here. But pilot author Robert N. Buck suggests acquiring a copy of the book, The Survival Book by Nesbitt, Pond, and Allen, and the Department of Transportation distributes several excellent manuals through the General Aviation Accident Prevention Program. Now, here's an example of that, Tips on Desert Flying. There are several lists in here, and one suggests the contents of a survival kit, another details survival rations and suggestions for a first aid kit. And these manuals contain valuable information on the proper operation of aircraft in deserts, and mountains, and in tropical and Arctic conditions. And this is all just part of what we have been talking about in this series of briefing, planning ahead and having an out. Now, after we pass the Mormon Mesa VOR, we can expect a descent to a more comfortable altitude. The most efficient way to descend is to set up the rate of descent that we desire, and I suggest 600 or 700 feet per minute in your aircraft, and then let the airspeed increase until it reaches the top of the green arc. That'll be about 180 knots in your bearing. As you descend, the manifold pressure will increase 1 inch for every 1,000 feet of altitude that you lose. Adjust the power when the airspeed reaches the yellow arc, or when the manifold pressure reaches the value you intend to use at the altitude to which you are descending. Now, of course, the mixture will become leaner as the air becomes denser, so adjust the mixtures to keep the EGT within the desired limits. Now this procedure will optimize your energy management and keep your engines warm during the descent. Of course, if you encounter any turbulence, you will reduce airspeed to slightly below VA or your maneuvering speed.
Yeah, I always stay out of that turbulent area and stay out of that yellow arc. But I always have the opinion that I've paid for that altitude, so I might as well, let it pay for me in terms of increased speed and on descent.
Yes, flying is a matter of energy management, and this is just part of that energy management.
Mm-hmm.
Now, during this en route briefing, Jack, we've discussed some of the performance limitations of your aircraft, some typical weather that you may encounter, communications and navigation difficulties, IFR emergencies, and advanced planning. Now, Jack, did we cover all the points which concerned you when we began planning this trip?
Well, as usual, Tony, I had about 3 or 4 concerns about single engine over the mountains and, of course, weather, and you brought up the strong issue of icing. And then we covered about another 93, which is the way I expect to be taught when I come to you. Yeah, we covered everything.
Well, good, because now we're approaching the Paradise VOR in the Los Angeles area, and it's time to get out the Los Angeles area chart and brief for the approach into Palomar. Are you ready for the approach briefing now?
I certainly am.